Well, we know President Trump is bothered by all of this. You only have to look at his Twitter feed. But at the same time, he's also clearly enjoying himself. Listen to what he told a crowd at Tuesday's rally in Tampa, Florida.
They just came out with a poll. Did you hear? The most popular person in the history of the Republican Party is Trump. Can you believe this? So I said, does that include Honest Abe Lincoln? You know, he was pretty good, right?
Well, the only problem with that comparison is there were no scientific opinion polls during Lincoln's time. White House reporter and friend of the show, Stephen Collinson, joins us now from Washington. As always, good to have you with us. The midterms are less than 100 days away, and typically the government loses seats during the midterm elections. President Trump was back amongst his base last night in Florida and back to his old playbook.
That's right, Linda. Midterm elections for first-term presidents are usually problematic, as you say. Were Donald Trump's Republicans to lose control of the House of Representatives, which at this point is perhaps a 50-50 proposition or better, it would have serious implications for his presidency, not just constraining his ability to move legislation through Congress, but of course, if Robert Mueller were to come back with a report critical of the president, it could even open the way to impeachment proceedings if there was a Democratic House. So that's why this is so important. And I think it's very clear that the president is becoming more and more concerned about what will happen in those elections for the whole of the House and a third of the Senate in November, and he basically is taking matters into his own hands, getting out there on the campaign trail where he was so successful in 2016 and trying to lift Republicans because of his deep sort of control of the party's base over the line.
Stephen, you wrote a great article on CNN.com about President Trump's skill at fanning resentment amongst his base. Get that anger in people got him elected. And we saw a lot of that anger last night targeted directly at the media, particularly CNN and our colleague, his name's Jim Acosta, just went blank. Let's just play that rally for you. You can hear that rally as Jim Acosta was doing a live shot on CNN. Is that anger inflaming people working for him?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump's entire political method is to identify fault lines, whether they're racial, societal, financial, in the electorate, and inflame them. It's what he does. It's how he's managed to get such an intense support base, even though a majority of the country still doesn't support him. That's what he did in 2016, and that's how he's going to try and get the maximum Republican turnout at these polls in November. He needs his people to be angry, to be resentment about the political establishment, about the media, which is called the enemy of the people, if he's going to get that kind of turnout, because the president himself is not on the ballot in November, even though this election is so important to him. So I think we're going to see him going out, especially once we get through the summer, beginning of September, doing several rallies a day even, in some cases, as we get closer to the election, to try and recreate that sort of pot-boiling anger among base Republican voters that swept him to the White House in 2016.
Yeah, certainly firing up that anger. And Stephen, the president offered to meet with Iran with no preconditions. That offer quickly dismissed by Iran's foreign minister, who wrote that, quote, threats, sanctions and PR stunts won't work. Mr. Trump referenced Iran last night at that same rally, but he didn't seem to have scrolled past this tweet on his timeline yet. Let's just take a listen.
The Iran nuclear deal, it's a horror show. I hope it works out well with Iran. They're having a lot of difficulty right now. I hope it works out well. And I have a feeling they'll be talking to us pretty soon.
Well, he still is hopeful that Iran will talk to them, even though they've dismissed it. And clearly he thinks that because his tactics with North Korea led to a summit, that it will work here.
Right. This is one of the most difficult things to work out in Washington right now, and it's what exactly is U.S. foreign policy. On Iran, for example, you have a very hard-line policy. They pulled out of the nuclear deal. You have a number of officials around the president who have a record of pushing for regime change in Iran, are very skeptical about dialogue with Iran, and then you have the president come out and say, oh, let's have talks with President Rouhani. There's this sort of dual-track foreign policy going on. I personally, I don't think that this was much more when the president made this offer of him sort of putting it out there that he'd like to have a summit with Iran because he had a summit with Kim Jong-un, he had a summit with Vladimir Putin. He likes these big summits and think they're an end in themselves. Clearly, it's a different situation than with North Korea. If you look at it from Iran's point of view, I think you have to ask what Iran's incentive would be for sitting down with the United States right now. They spent 2 years doing a nuclear deal with the United States and other great world powers, only for the Trump administration to pull out and impose new sanctions. So it seems very unlikely that Iran will be willing to agree to a deal that would be more advantageous to the U.S. than the original deal. I think the administration is trying to up the pressure on Iran in the hope that it drives the Iranians back to the table for economic reasons. But when you look at the political impediments to actually that happening in Iran and the ideological climb down that would require from the Iranians, it seems very unlikely that President Trump's hopes of any such engagement with Iran are likely to come to pass.
Yeah, clearly Iran thinks America can't be trusted. Stephen Collinson, good to have you with us for all of that. Thanks so much. One last thing we want to point out from that rally in Florida. It became apparent that Mr. Trump may be a bit, well, out of touch with the common man. Take a listen to what he had to say about buying groceries.
Which is why the time has come for voter ID, like everything else. Voter ID.